Hello everyone, welcome to week 5. There's no particular reason for me to be outside to give this lesson. I just didn't want to be cooped up in my travel trailer anymore. Just a brief bit of information. My wife and I live in a very small place. She works from home, so we don't have a lot of room for me to be doing these lessons from home, so I've been out in the travel trailer. If you look at the backdrop, it's kind of plain and simple, but it works. But thought I'd get outside today. Wanted to talk briefly about sketches before we go any further. I know that was from last week, the reading and then the assignment and everything, but there's a bunch of different ways in the book that talks about how to do sketches, and there's different ways, different theories about doing them, but the easiest is just the simple baseline X and Y that I talked about. And it's just as simple as this. I've got some notes here: graph paper, ruler, pencil, eraser, and a clipboard. That's all you need. A couple of tape measures as well to go different directions. Sometimes if you have nice equipment, you can put these measuring tapes that stick to the wall, and they make it a lot easier for doing baseline measurements. You don't have to keep worrying about measure that may spool up or get caught in stuff, and just put it on the wall. And then when you're done with your scene, you just peel it off. But a couple thoughts there. You go to do the baseline. Make sure you photograph whatever you do, whether it's a tape measure in either direction. Make sure you take photographs of it so that in case in court you're asked about how you got these measurements, you can reference that. So always photograph everything that you do. So today we're going to be going over evidence collection, and while evidence collection itself is the last step in the process, first we want to go through a few points here. First up is what to seize. And so I'm going to read a little bit here. Forgive me, I got to take my glasses off. I want to see if to read here. So every crime scene has unique items of evidence that are commonly searched for and seized. Some items may be common to any crime, such as fingerprints. A certain amount of discretion must be used in deciding what to seize that it connects to the crime, its evidentiary value, the quantities to seize, and how to package and label the items. So a couple thoughts on that. Fingerprints are going to be all through a residence. People who live there are going to deposit the fingerprints. It's the people who aren't supposed to be there. If their fingerprints are there, that puts them and them only at that crime scene. So it's very important. So if you're processing, say, a burglary, and one of the things I remember coming across regularly is people would keep a glass container full of coins. And that was a beautiful thing to get fingerprints from. Now, granted, the person, the resident, would probably have their fingerprints on it, but usually whoever was in either a hurry or something would grab that and perhaps dump it in their backpack. Or the other thing that's commonly used on crime scenes are pillowcases. Is someone will take the pillowcase and then they'll stuff all the stuff in there and then use that as their backpack to carry everything away. But anyway, so they dump this out, and then you could dust that. And while yes, you're going to find the resident's prints on there, you're also potentially going to find the suspect. So that's always something to look at. So let's keep going here. So connection to the crime. How does the item you are considering seizing connect to the crime? Don't take it just because it's there. So make sure there's a purpose behind it. Like perhaps if you had that same jar of coins and it's tipped over and it's on the floor, you might realize that, hey, I don't really want to process this here where I'm just going to dust. I might want to take it back to the lab where I can do cyanoacrylate fuming, which is other nice way of saying superglue fuming. That does a much better job, and it's going to make those fingerprints more permanent and easier to lift. So you might want to take it with you. So something to think about would be items of value that you can take back and process more carefully at your lab, if you have a lab. Next up here is items left behind by the suspect. It struck me when I first started doing this is kind of a surprise that people would leave stuff behind, but they do. They'll leave tools from another burglary. They potentially could leave items that were taken out of, say you have a string of vehicle prowls and they take somebody's insurance paperwork. Well, you end up finding that in another person's vehicle. So keep an eye out for things that absolutely don't belong, and that's where you and the homeowner or the vehicle owner are going to have to go through and have them tell you what belongs and what doesn't belong. Next up is the item a direct result of the crime? And what I would think about with something like that is maybe it's not an item, but it could be something that's damaged. How they got into the residence. Did they force a door? Did they use a particular pry tool to force that door? That's where you'd be looking at the door jamb and seeing if there's any indentations or damage. Not only do you photograph it, but you'd use a scale to measure the photographs, and then you would also perhaps use some kind of a casting compound in order to make an imprint of it that you could save for later. If there's a string of burglaries, perhaps you could compare that same to see if it's the same casting, same tool used in each burglary. In talking about evidentiary value, it says here, what are your expectations of the item to seize, and what will it do to solve the crime to assist in prosecution? An item that's been touched but perhaps you can't get fingerprints from would be a great item to collect to later swab for DNA and send that to the crime lab. One caveat to that is oftentimes our crime lab won't take property crimes because they're backlogged with people crimes, much more serious than property, say rapes or homicides or serious assaults. They'll be working on those. So they'll take that evidence long before they would take any kind of property crime. But they might take, if there's a series of burglaries and you have collected DNA, they might take that because that would be a felony level and they might have room for it. But it also might take a long time. There's a considerable backlog with our state lab. Next item here is how much to seize. That's really important. It gives the idea that it's better to seize more items than necessary, but you want to be careful about that. You don't want to take everything that's in a hotel room or even a residence or anything like that. You don't need to. You have to look at it carefully and say, is this somehow attached to the crime? Was it moved? Is there a potential for DNA or fingerprints or anything like that? Or blood? Is there blood on it that you're going to need to collect as well? So think about that. It says, be responsible when using discretion. Think about why you are seizing this piece of evidence so that you can articulate it later. Always ask why in everything you do. That's so important because you're going to be asked, why did you do that? So have that answer already figured out before you take it. Look at something and say, why do I need this? And then once you can articulate that in your notes and then translate that to your report, it'll be very easy when it comes up in court. Says, don't let fatigue be your driving force. You're going to get exhausted when you process a crime scene. It's just no other way about it. It can take hours and hours and hours, and even after many years of doing it, would always tend to underguess how long it would take to process a scene. The longest I've ever done on a scene or a shift where I completed a shift and then was called back was about 26 hours, and it's pretty intense. By the end of that 26 hours, I can't say I was thinking my clearest, but there's enough of us on scene that we all were able to help each other, but I don't recommend it. So take breaks when you can. I went to a homicide class in Mount Vernon a number of years ago, and what they said when processing a crime scene was to stop, say every hour, just take a complete break, walk out of the room or walk out of the residence, go outside, think about what you're doing, wonder aloud, am I going down the correct path here? Should I think about this differently? You know, if you need to take a coffee break or whatever, do so. It's really, really important to not get locked into one direction with your evidence gathering or your theories about what happened. You want to think about it with an open mind and keep that open mind all the way through. Because again, like I've mentioned in previous things, not only is it about convicting the guilty, but it's also about exonerating the innocent, and that's critical. You want to make sure that you are going down the right path. You might be surprised, and it's good to be surprised, and someone you may think could very well be involved in something may turn out to be entirely innocent. So it's important to keep an open mind. Don't let haste be a driving force. Now what that means is you're working a scene and you've got 20 calls holding, or the city has 20 calls holding, and you've only got 4 officers and 3 of them are tied up on this scene, and your sergeant's getting on the air and saying, what time are you going to be done? You can't let them worry about that. Then your sergeant needs to call in more people or do an assist agency with the county or whoever you're working with and have them cover for you, because you need to process that scene. You only get one chance to do it. You can't go back. Once the scene has been released, you never can go and back to it, especially by release. I mean, other people can go there. Even if it hasn't been changed, even if nobody's been there, you can't necessarily say for sure that that's happened. So it's never going to hold up in court if you go back to later process a scene after it's been released. Now, what you can do is hold a scene. If you have someone who, or if your crew is tired, I know we did an assist agency out in the county a number of years ago where we processed out at a residence at a homicide for about probably 4 days. And at night, we had an overtime shift of an officer or 2 out there holding the scene for us so that no one could come or go. They were scene security all night. And then we'd go home, we'd sleep, come back in the morning and do it all over again. So that way, we never gave up custody of the scene. So when you talk about chain of custody, we maintained that scene for the whole entire 4 days. We never gave that up. So the next note here is about crime lab recommendations. And the Washington State Patrol provides a really good manual for crime scenes, and so if you have any doubts, look at the crime lab manual. It's really good. It's updated fairly regularly, And if you have questions, I found that the folks at the crime lab are terrific, and you can give them a call, not necessarily at 2 in the morning when you're processing a scene. Call them during business hours the next day and say, hey, I've got this, how would you process that? And you'll find that they'll be very helpful for you and want to guide you and do it correctly. Because if it's coming to them later on, they want to be able to receive it correctly. If it needs further analysis that only the crime lab can do, then they would want to receive it a certain way. So they'll help you any way they can. It makes my job easier, it makes it easier in court, and it makes their job easier as well. Okay, packaging. Packaging is really important. It has to be done right, and you have to think about cross-contamination all the time. So I think I've mentioned in another video about putting stuff in a bag, you know, whatever that evidence item is, in one, we use 8 by 11 manila envelopes or sometimes white envelopes, and then you have a fresh pair of gloves on when you do that, and then you close the envelope, and then you change gloves and put the next item in the next envelope, and you're changing gloves all the time. You probably go through a box of gloves at any crime scene. It's a real common occurrence, but there's a real meticulous way to do it. In Canvas, I'm going to have a way to show you how to package these things, and it'll explain it all. And so you have your envelope, you seal it, and then you use evidence tape over the openings so that everything's closed, and then you have to sign and date, put the case number on it so the markings are on the tape as well as on the envelope, and so that way it shows that nothing's been opened. So you have to be real careful about that. You can't be sloppy with it because that'll reflect badly in court. Some people will ask about paper versus plastic. So say you've got a bloody shirt from a stabbing, for example. Okay, what do you do with that? You think, oh, I should put it in plastic because it'll be drippy. Well, no, actually you don't. So you may put it in plastic very, very briefly to transport it from the scene to the station, but then at the station you should have, at least we did, a place where you can secure it, where it can hang up and dry. So you always want, if something is bloody, then you want to dry it. If it's wet, you want to dry it. And so we have are these secure drying racks where you could place items inside there, close them up, and then put a seal on it so no one could get in there, which will also, and it's in a locked area where no one else can get in, and then that would maintain that chain of custody. But you want to make sure that it's dry, so maybe you come back a few days later, and then it'll be dry, and then you would bag it up in paper. The reason we use paper is because paper can breathe. You may not think so, but it does, and it breathes enough so that things don't get moldy, because you may have that bloody t-shirt for a couple of years, or if it's a homicide, you might have it for decades, and so it's something that you just don't get rid of, and it has to be kept in such a manner that it's not going to be moldy, where if it was plastic and there was no air permeability, then it would certainly get moldy, and then not only would it destroy your evidence, but it would also make a mess of your evidence room.